Hey Dom, good to be chatting. Robbie Vann-Adibé here, a Brit who spent the bulk of his career in the US, much of it on the West Coast, in the technology area. A coder to begin with, rose through the ranks, added to the skill set, became a manager, then became a senior manager, then became a co-founder, and then became a founder. So I've been doing this stuff a long while. I recently returned to this side of the pond, and I'm having fun helping friends, associates scale their businesses.
Very good. Very good. What was your most successful exit then? Or exits.
There's two in the mix. One was the shortest time spent with the greatest return, and the other one was the greatest overall return. So the shortest amount of time was a company called Illustra. I joined as head of product management there and was there all of 12 months, and we got acquired by Informix for, at the time, what was considered a heck of a lot of money. Today it's rounding error, but back then it was real money. And so from the time spent there versus the return that I got, it was a great run. A lot of great people, a lot of fun. We basically figured out that you would store a web page as atoms in a database, as atomic elements in the database, and then compile it on the fly. Turned out that was the right way. That's the way the web works today. In fact, our technology is one of the P's in PHP, Postgres. It was the commercialization of Postgres. In terms of overall numbers, best exit was a company called Vine, of which I was the co-founder with a guy called Eric Greenberg. We started off life as Silicon Valley Internet Partners, and the premise was simple. It was the spring of April 96. Building transaction-based websites at that time was a very difficult thing to do. The tech stack was hard. Stack is a bit of a misnomer. You had to sort of hand code the bulk of it. And I knew a handful of people, about 20 guys, who knew how to do this stuff. And so we started a consulting firm to build transaction-based websites for people. And as they say in life, so much of everything is timing. So much of success is timing. And our timing was about as perfect as it got. The big five, as they were back then, Anderson, EY, Deloitte, and so on, were all focused on Y2K projects. And so anything less than $1 million, sometimes it was even $5 million, was of almost no interest to those guys. They were so focused on the big stuff. And so, if you had a website to build, you didn't want to spend that kind of money in the beginning. You just wanted to try it out to see what the result might be. So we were there with a number of other small organizations. All of us grew very rapidly, and it was real fun. We went public in June of 96.
With what revenue?
No, we had real revenue.
Yeah.
I'm not remembering how much revenue, but we had real revenue. No, and we were profitable. I'm sure I can dig those numbers up at some point.
1996, 45 million people in the world were on the internet then. Now it's 5.5 billion.
Let's be clear. When you say people were online, I remember
dial-up modem.
I remember A, dial-up modem. B, I remember Coca-Cola.com. I remember the big release was that the Coca-Cola logo had flames around it. That was like, and that was it. It didn't do anything else. It just had Coca-Cola logo with flames around it. And they paid someone to build that for them. And that was the era where everyone was trying to figure out, what did my business look like? And the thing that was very clear to us as an organization was this wasn't about building technology, right? You had to go back to foundational issues like, what is my business? What do I do with that business online? So for instance, in the early days, we were working with Compaq. And I remember sitting in one of the meetings, and most senior people at Compaq said, we don't want to sell our PCs online because we'll cannibalize our channel. Thus ensued very long. I mean, these conversations went on for weeks, months even, about what it meant for a company like Compaq to sell PCs online and what it meant to quote unquote cannibalize the channel. And, our message was always the same as a company, which is if you don't cannibalize it, someone else will do it for you. And all the other guys, remember there was Gateway and other folks that, had essentially fully embraced the online model. Everyone else had to play catch up. So you had to work through with them what the business issues were with regard to doing that. Pricing, logistics, delivery, all that stuff were issues to be worked out.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because clients have similar conversations today about what does digital transformation mean. And by and large, they're having the same types of conversations.
Dom, unfortunately, we have enough grey hairs to be able to say we've been doing this stuff a while. And I think the bit that's just fascinating to me is that it's the same conversations, a little bit different flavor, a little bit sort of variations on a theme, but a lot of the core stuff is the same. And often that's true of the technology as well. The way a lot of these technologies work are kind of the way that they used to. But, I guess the only thing that I look at and say, wow, we never really did anything like that before is basically the new data science, machine learning, quote unquote AI stuff. That's new. I don't remember anybody doing stuff like that before. And it's a different way of thinking about problems. It's fascinating and the opportunities are endless, but those questions are around, well, what do we do with it and how do we do things with it? Though, those questions are the same questions. It's just they end up with different answers, right?
Yeah. Well, I think I was talking to a client this morning and now they can probably analyze some data in a way that they couldn't have done before.
Yes.
They can go looking for patterns. They've got a tool that will allow them to go and looking for patterns rather than have a human being trying to do it.
Yes. I'm fascinated by the realm. It was enough to drive me back to school. I did a bunch of Coursera courses in the AI realm to really get back to basics and figure out, okay, when people say AI, what do they really mean? And
versus machine learning.
Versus machine learning. And of course, it is machine learning, right? There is no AI yet. It is machine learning.
But for a while, about a year ago, people were still arguing about that. And now they don't argue. They just call it AI now.
They do. I know. And as do I, because it's too, itty bitty to get into the, what? No, it's machine learning.
Some of the things that haven't changed are the people and what it takes to build a business. And so what are some of the sort of heuristics or fundamentals that you now think to be true or know to be true about starting a business and scaling a business? What are some of the things that have we caught up? Is the ecosystem in Europe the same as it is in the US?
I think that we've caught up most of the way.
Okay.
When I went to the US in 85, I started doing business on the West Coast in 89. Nothing of that ilk really existed in Europe at that time, or at least I wasn't privy to it. The whole ecosystem was in full swing. You had the venture community, you had the lawyers able to structure early stage businesses, you had the marketing consultants and all the people that you needed to help build businesses. You had real estate guys willing to take equity in lieu of rent. I mean, the whole thing was structured to allow people to start businesses very easily and very quickly. And that ecosystem didn't exist in Europe. There was another piece, right, which is the colleges churning out kids who didn't want to go work for a big company. They wanted to go work for a startup. That was part of the ecosystem as well. And successful entrepreneurs who had built technology companies previously, who were willing to put their hands in their pocket, write a check to a promising idea and sort of provide that seed stage funding and more importantly, advice to those folks. It was everywhere, right? Again, that really didn't start coming into being until The first go round was when I came back to Europe briefly in 1999, 2000. So we had a brief flurry of it then. And then when the crash hit, it all went away, but began to build slowly and slowly, right? Now we've got all those things, right? And if I had to call out what the most important part of that is I think it's successful entrepreneurs who've done this before, who are happy and willing to work with people embarking on the journey for the first, or the first few times. That makes all the difference, I think, right? Those folks are willing to write checks, but they're also more importantly able to provide counsel and advice on, and here's what you do when you run into this problem. Here's what you do when you get to this stage, kind of thing.
The thing is that it's, you spend your time doing that. I spend a lot of my time doing that, because people are hitting those speed bumps in the road or first time round. And it's much quicker if somebody just says, look, there's not a lot of learning here. Just here's the answer.
Yeah, here's the answer. And I'll come back to that, because that issue of here's the answer and what happens next plays into how I pick what to get involved in. But yes, I believe Europe has caught up. And actually, we've got a little of an edge that they don't have in the US, which is that because we have social systems set up to catch people so they don't fall too far. We have free healthcare. We have free education. We have a lot of other stuff in place. You are able to take risks to go at new things, perhaps more easily than you do in the US. Now, I know that's counterintuitive and you don't hear that as being the narrative, but I actually think there's something to that here. And, there used to be a time, no doubt, where in the US, if you failed, no one cared. It was like, okay, you failed, have another go. In Europe, there were much bigger issues associated with that, right? I think that the attitude, again, is now here. That's probably one of the big things that have changed, which is the cultural attitude to failure. It's more acceptable. It's more acceptable to swing miss. No one cares if you step up again to swing again. There's something to that. I don't know if you see that as well, but
I think I suppose access to capital I don't see as a challenge, but I do think there's maybe an attitude around I'm going to build the biggest company in the world in a thing. And I talked to Herman Simon a number of times, and he said, he wrote a book called Hidden Champions, where he looked for all of the privately held businesses in the world that did $1 billion. And he found lots of them in Germany because he felt as though Germans would go global quickly. He thinks now those businesses don't do that. Chinese businesses will do that. But I speak to a lot of people in the UK and in the US, because you've got a single market. I think people would go niche because there's a big enough single market. In the UK, they start to go broad much more quickly. They feel as though going to the US is going to be impossible. Going to France and Germany is a different language. And there's sort of starting a business on our island. I think there's some challenges around. But I meet people who've started businesses in Germany and Spain. And again, they're doing business in English and they're going global from the beginning. So almost if anything, the attitude is more global from Europe than it is from here.
I would totally agree with that. And more global than the US thinks as well.
Yes. What you see so often, it's just easier to build. It takes a long time before you need to go to the rest of the world.
Yeah, no. And it's not as instinctive a thing to do in the US as it is to do here. Here, our markets, quote unquote, are also small, that you have no choice but to go elsewhere, right? In the US, because it's so big, you don't have to go elsewhere for a while. I think the bit that's changed in that is the web is global, right? You put your product up. As long as you do a good job of describing it sufficiently, much of the world does business in English. I know it's a terrible thing to say that, but there is some truth to that. It's the language of technology, or appears to be. And the reality is now that if you build the right website, people all over the world will find your product. it's happened with many of the companies I've been associated with, where you start off with a geographic focus, and before not too long at all, you've got customers all over the world because people are finding your product and they want to use it, right? And especially if it's one of these, if it's the characteristics seem to be if it's in a niche sector where that sector operates the same all over the world, tick, that does it, right? Or if you're so unique in what you're doing and so cutting edge and the technology just doesn't exist elsewhere, that pulls you global as well, right? The early adopters exist in every market, right? And so when you've got a great piece of technology that just doesn't exist elsewhere, you'll get dragged internationally, whether you like it or not. So yeah, I remember when there was a rule of thumb that said, you had to assign $1 million per country to go global. It was like, that's the cost to go global. You're going to have to get the legal work. You're going to have to translate the product. You're going to have to, people are going to fly back and forth and whatever. And your budget, and this was circa late 90s, was $1 million per country. Ain't so anymore.
No. Well, now certainly I've got a number of clients who are remote first businesses and have employees maybe in 10 or 15 countries.
Yeah. No, I listened to the interview you did with Jay, and that's the perfect encapsulation of going global, in this world that we have today of network connections and Zoom calls and so on. I mean, she built from, what was it, 4 people to 70 people and 20 million ARR completely remotely. I mean, in 18 months. I mean, that's a great story. Everyone should listen to that. I forget what the number podcast is, but I think you did it relatively recently.
Jay Arthur. Yeah, it was maybe a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah. And we were chatting before we pressed record. You've got a bootstrap versus take money, bootstrap but VC. What's the...
Yeah. At risk of offending all our VC friends.
They're hard to offend. Come on. They've got thick skins.
First of all, I think we do our entrepreneurial colleagues or the younger ones just maybe starting out on this journey a disservice by always describing the journeys of the Googles and the Facebooks and the, and so on of the world, because they're the black swan events, right? They're the exceptions. That's not how most businesses go. And yet all the narrative, all the history, all the lessons come from businesses like that. And yet, there is a lot of other ways to do stuff out there, and not everything makes sense to fund with large sums of money from other folks, from a fund and, the quote unquote venture model. There are other ways to do this, right? And I always tell early stage entrepreneurs, folks really just getting going, to study up on Atlassian, Cannon Brooks and the guys. An amazing story, taking Jira and essentially engineering first, allowing people to find the stuff, taking an open source approach to it, getting them to pay when they move to the enterprise edition and so on. And essentially that company was bootstrapped, and they did take capital right at the end. And, I think the story goes something to the effect of the money that they took before they went public was still sitting in the bank when they went public. They didn't raise money because they needed money. They raised money because they wanted to get the right people around the table. So when they did go public, the market would behave the way they hoped it would behave, which it did. But they didn't do it for the money. They built a business that essentially was cash flow positive and profitable from the get-go. And I think that bootstrappable model is something that we should do, guys like us who try and help people going on this journey. We should do a better job of explaining to people, when do you do that and how do you do it? And what are the positives and what are the negatives, right? There is a time occasionally in those things to take capital. And that is When you found product market fit and you need to go faster, that's when you take the money. Taking money when you're still trying to figure out where the market is, it is a very dangerous thing for everyone involved, I think. And I don't know, I've been doing this a long time now, and I think I've done most permutations. I've taken money from excellent organizations that, helped me build great businesses, but it's not the only way to do it.
Yeah. And how many of the businesses you're currently involved in are bootstrapped versus VC backed?
Bootstrap, again, the term for me, bootstrap is you don't raise institutional money. You might raise some money, but it's from friends and family. In that case, all of them. None of the things I'm working with right now have institutional involvement. There's pros and cons with that.
Profitable, all of them? Yet?
One of them is. Two of them, we're still figuring it out. We're using revenue. We're using revenue from opportunities to fund the growth of the business, which is incredibly hard, but doable, right? It's a different playbook, but there is a playbook for it.
Instead of flaming out quickly, it's the hard yards. It also depends on the market segment.
It does. Absolutely. And it depends on the opportunity, right? If you really have found gold in them there hills, right, and no one else is there, then maybe taking capital to dominate the market and be the only player and take 80% market share is the way to go. But not all markets look like that, right? Not all opportunities look like that. Some segments are small, they're a couple of billion in opportunity, which sounds big, but to some folks that sounds small, right? But if you can build a business that does a couple $100 million a year in revenue and is profitable, well, there's a lot of value in that, right?
You're not going to be as famous as the founders of Google, but you can build a sustainable business there.
You can build a sustainable business and you can make a lot of people very happy, right? You can make your team financially successful. You can become financially successful. I mean, maybe if you need, Bugatti Chiron or things like that to make your day go well, then maybe not. But if you don't need that, then there's a lot of opportunity down at the bottom, right?
And so what do you think, what does it take? I mean, if you're not going to go and borrow money and you're going to do the hard yards, what are the things that just have to be true?
Well, we talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but one of the things I always tell early stage entrepreneurs is there is one of the unwritten pieces of history of many of the most successful companies that we know of all have this fact in it, which is at the beginning, there were always two of them. We all know Bill Gates of Microsoft. Not so many people know, at least in this generation, know who Paul Allen was. Paul Allen was the technical guy who built MS-DOS, right? Bill was the guy who sold it. Now, Bill became more technical over time, but Paul Allen was the technical guy. Apple. Jobs was the business guy. Steve Wozniak was the technology guy. Oracle. Larry Ellison was the business guy, and Bob Eisner was the technical guy. All right. So, and you can go down the list. You can keep going down the list. Most of them at the beginning had two folks because it's very difficult for two, at the early stage, when you're young, to do both. You're either really good at the business part because that's what you've learned to do, or you're really good at the technical part because that's what you've learned to do. Being able to do both there's not many folks who do both well. So you find the other person who can do the thing that you can't do, and you team up with them and you build the business together. Now, oftentimes what happens is people evolve. Bill Gates is clearly a deep technologist at this point, right? And a great businessman. And so, people add skills as the years go by that allow them to play the larger role. And that means that the team at the top changes. Paul Allen made the decision to leave Microsoft at a fairly early stage because he was so financially successful. He didn't want to continue. right? So, that process of building the team becomes the journey. So in the beginning, there are two. Then there's how do you build the team? And, I know that you and I have talked in the past about this. Building the right team is everything, right? It's more important than the money. It's more important than the market opportunity. It's more important than anything. Having the right group of people to do this with determines whether you're successful or not. So how do you go about finding the right people? And so I spend a lot of time talking people through hiring processes, right? Because that's where it begins. How do you hire good people? I.e., what does that interview look like? Right. And so at Viant, we fine tuned this to the nth degree. We spent a lot of time figuring out how to hire great people and making sure that we did it well. And we grew incredibly fast. First year, I think we finished at 24. Second year, we were 50. Third year, we were 100 and something. Third year, we were 250 and so on, right? And if you're hiring 100 people in a year, then you're interviewing 1,000 people at least. So you have to have scalable processes for these, right? Which means that you need to have some technology in there. We built our own back then, but there are now technology for doing these things. But, I always say the keys are this. I won't talk about where you place your ads to find good people or what that process looks like, but assume that you found someone who you think is the candidate. Step one is, do they have the skills required of the role? So there is a series of technical interviews to determine, does this person have the skills to do the role that you're looking for them to do, right? And I've always found that, most people interview poorly. They ask questions where they go, do you know how to code X? And the person goes, yes, I do know how to code X. And they go, okay, do you know how to code Y? Interviewing processes that request evidence. Now, I think Google and the gang may have taken it a little too far with some of the tests that they give people. Now, it's one way of ensuring that your engineers know how to code is to test them. And I know in a lot of places that they do that. And there is merit to that. But there's also merit to figuring out, can this person solve problems? And that's what you're looking for. In the early part of a business, it's, do they have the skills and are they problem solvers? Do they run through walls to solve problems? Right? So there's the technical fit. Tick. You find that they get technical fit. Then the next piece is cultural fit, right? Does this person fit the culture of the business that we're trying to create? Again, you and I have been at this a while. We all know there are incredibly capable people who are a nightmare to work with, right? And vice versa. There are really, really nice people who don't know anything, right? So, making sure that they are a cultural fit to the business that you're trying to build is appropriate. And different companies have different cultures. Some companies are more aggressive than others. Some companies are less aggressive than others. Others, it's different. Once you've figured out what kind of company you're going to be, you need to find people that fit that culture. And the other piece of that I always stress is no group interviews. I think they're a complete and utter waste of time. I say that definitively. I think one-on-one interviews are the only way to grow. You get a group of 3 people interviewing one candidate, you're wasting everybody's time, in my opinion. Number one. Number two is, because you're going to do one-on-one interviews, what you do is you make sure that everyone's taking notes during their interview, and that at the end of that interview process, say they talk to 3, 4, 5 people, that you all sit in a room and you compare the notes that you have taken on the person you have talked to, right? Because in today's world, people learn from the interview before, right? So they'll say, oh yeah, I really like doing X. And you go, oh, we don't do it that way. We do it this way. And then the next person they talk to, oh, I always do it this way, because they've figured out from the interview that they just had that they have to say something different, right? So you've got to have a set of notes so you can truly triangulate on, where is this person coming from. At Viant, one of the rules that we had during interview process was this, right? You had to say whether you would be willing to work with that individual. And you weren't allowed to this. You had to this or that.
Up or down.
And if you had 5 people interviewing someone and any one of them went this, the process was over. That was it. It means that you cycle through a lot of people trying to find the right candidates, right? But it also means that your chances of getting the right people into the business increase dramatically. And, we, back in the Viant days, it was a minimum of 10 interviews, five for technical skills and 5 for cultural fit. And I know that sounds crazy, but the culture that came out of that was unbelievable.
Do you know, I think you're absolutely right. I every now and again reread the Jim Collins's books, and I'm struck every time that I feel as I'm probably quite harsh with clients on their process for improving the quality of their people. And then I read Jim Collins' stuff and I realize I'm not maniacal enough. And I was with a client last week, and, sometimes you get your breaths taken away. So they have a recruitment process. And if somebody fails the process partway through, they still carry on. Why would you do that? And somebody went, I don't know. No, it's a good question. Let's change that. But it's, 5 interviews. And if somebody gave, thumbs down at interview 2, they would still do interview 3, 4, 5. It's like, don't do that. You're just wasting your time. Somebody's already decided that this candidate's not going to make it. Stop.
Yeah.
Stop wasting your time.
It's why at Viant, one of the things that we would do, so Friday, we were a hiring machine. So our structure was Friday mornings were interview mornings across our network of offices. You basically said to people, assume that from 9 to 12 on a Friday morning, there is a high likelihood that you will be asked to interview folks. And lunch was basically you'd get everyone in a room who'd done interviews that morning, and we provided lunch to the team of people that did the interviewing, and you'd ask people to give their feedback. And it became part of the culture. Everybody knew that was what Friday mornings were for, and it wasn't one of those, oh man, you're telling me I have to do that kind of thing, people were happy to participate in that process because they were part of building the company.
Yeah, I've got a good friend who is at Amazon. He's worked for me a couple of times, and I was out for dinner with him recently. He's one of their bar raisers. And, I think he did 300 interviews last year. And it's, he just, the hiring managers have to use him and the other bar raisers. And they have to prove to Mike that the person they want to hire is better than half the people in their team. And I love that. It just forces you to be constantly raising the bar rather than allowing it to come down, and takes the pressure of pace or feeling under pressure to hire, takes that away. Well, it doesn't take it away. It just means you can't bend to it.
Which brings me to one of the other pieces of my hiring philosophies, right? Which is hire people better than you. And it's one of those things where it all just trips off we've been saying this for 30 years. I remember the first time I heard that, I'm like, wow, that's a really interesting concept. Sounds like a good idea. And then I watched people do it. And here's what happens. If you are ever really talking to an individual who really is better than you, 99% of people won't hire that person because they're afraid. If this person really is better than me, then they're going to call me out on issues, and they're going to show me that I'm wrong, and they might take my job, and they may end up. Most people don't have the courage to take that step. And, if you have the courage to hire people who really are better than you, you're going to build a world-class company. That's the way that you do it.
I think what goes hand in hand with that is, I say to so many times in an organization, the managers, particularly in a fast-growing businesses, don't really want to be managers. They're managers because they were first in, longest there, best skill as an individual contributor. And I was with a client recently, and they thought maybe a third of their managers were people that they would rehire into a management role, but only a third. The other 2/3 were people, they are where they are. And I often say to those managers, look, your job is to make yourself redundant, and it has the same impact on people, sets off their fight and flight response. They're fearful. And I say, because you can't, look, this business is doubling in size every 2 or 3 years. You're going to be passed by people unless you can free yourself up to be promoted. You need to make yourself redundant. Your job is to build your team.
Yeah.
And if you can hire somebody really better than you, you can get out of that seat quicker.
That's exactly right. I had exactly that experience. I was working in this fast-growing organization, and all these opportunities were popping up, and I was being passed over, and I went into the CEO's office, and I'm like, what's going on? You're giving all this great stuff to all these other people. Am I not doing a good? He's like, no, you're incredible. I'm like, so what? He's like, but you're too valuable. I can't take you out of this role, because if I take you out of this role, who's going to do it? And the light bulb went on. I'm like, I got to hire my replacements. I've got to show that I am quote unquote redundant, and that I'm good at what I do, so that when all the new opportunities come along, that I can get a chance to do those things. So, I'm totally with you. That you've got to manage your way out of the role so you can go and do other fun things.
I think that's one of the sort of managers who are A players will hire people better than them, and that those sort of B players will hire.
They hire C players. I mean, again, we can be honest on these things, but B players hire C players. They don't hire B players, they hire C players. And that's when problems really start, right?
It goes off quickly. I was listening to a book about, how did Amazon put in this bar raiser methodology? And they'd hired this guy to be director of software development as they were scaling up their software development team massively. And he brought in a load of guys from his old company. And, his fellow directors are standing there going, they're just not very good. And it's like, well, what can we do that's helpful to the whole organ? And, it's like trying to solve this problem. And, and then bar raising becomes it, right? So that protects you from managers. Or, certainly one of the things that killed Rackspace was we hired a load of people in from outside who brought in their own culture, and we didn't have something like bar raising or a really robust culture fit process in place. And, it went from being an organization without much politics to being an organization riven with politics very, very quickly.
Just, remember the old TV show Kung Fu, and he takes the pebble from his hand and he goes, time to leave, right? I always, the minute that starts, time to leave, right? It's, no, but, we have the opportunity to help shape those things so that it's never time to leave, right? And I think this thing of what is our culture, again, I was very intentional about that in companies that I was founder of. Very early on, would sit down with the group of people I was doing it with and say, what is our culture? Let's articulate what that is. You can't do it on day one. You can write a bunch of stuff that you aspire to, but until you've actually been doing it for a bit, you actually don't know what your culture is. Your culture will then emerge after 6 months, and that's when you write it down. You say, this is our culture. This is where we're going. If these aren't your values, you should go now, right? If these aren't your values, don't join us, right? You've got to be clear on those things, right?
We did a session with the leadership team a few years ago, and we did sort of that culture definition process. And they left after a day, and the CEO rang me up and he said, "Okay, one of them's quit on the way home." He said, which is just perfect. He just said, if this is where we're going, this company's not for me. And he said, that's perfect. Because he said, look, if we can't write these down in a way that they repel as well as attract, then, we haven't written them in a way that they'll be too vanilla. So they worked really hard to try and make them punchy.
Yeah. At Viant, when we did this, rule number one, we went round it over and over and over. And I'm like, no assholes. And everyone looked round and everyone was like, we can't put that on. I'm like, yes, we can. You know what? We can put it on whatever. It's our company. We want to put that as rule number one. We can put that as rule number one. And I remember we had a brass plaque, and item one was no assholes. And, I want to say we were the first guys to do that. I know someone wrote a book about it, but subsequently, whatever. But to my knowledge, we were the first guys to actually put it on a brass plate. And the really interesting thing about that is everyone knows exactly what that means. Everyone knows exactly what that means. And if you articulate that you are really serious about that being one of your rules, that will, to your point, attract and repel folks. And, I think there is something to that whole once you get that list right, people should be able to look at it and go, yep, that's the company I want to work for. I wouldn't work for those guys in a million years. Right. And, it becomes a very powerful defining tool for the business. And perhaps the most important thing is that the leaders live those rules. One of the things that, you see is that the people around you want to see whether that was just window dressing or whether in fact you really believe those things. And, I remember a story from the Viant days that was sort of definitive around that. So we had been trying to hire a head of marketing, a CMO for the business for a long time. We went through all kinds of candidates. We were spending real money with Ramsey Byrne, who were like one of the most expensive search firms of that era, trying to find the right candidate. And we'd found and rejected, probably a dozen senior folks. And we were starting to track towards IPO, and you couldn't IPO without someone in that seat. So we had to find someone. Finally, we found a person. They interviewed in the other offices and passed muster. None of this, none of whatever. I think they went through, Boston and New York, and they were now coming to San Francisco to interview and just make sure, because we didn't want to get it wrong. And the company had started in San Francisco. We had ended up relocating the head office, HQ, to Boston, because that's what the VCs wanted. So this guy arrives. And, I interview him. And at the end of my interview, I say, look, you're going to talk to 4 other people. And we need to be really clear on something, which is these are real interviews. This is not perfunctory stuff. People are going to be asking you difficult questions. And I need you to respect the process and treat it the way you would a real interview process. He's like, absolutely, not a problem. So we interview and whatever. Guy leaves and we have lunch, and everyone who's done interviews that day comes into the thing. And we're like, well, let's start with this folk. How do you do? And we go around the room. 4 people do this, and 1 person does this.
Gives you a thumbs down.
I'm like, oh my God. And the person that was giving them the thumbs down was literally brand new to the company. It was their first job. They'd just come out of school. They'd been through a great, super smart person, young lady. I won't mention her name. She'll know who she is. And I was like, so tell me what happened in the interview. And she said, well, we began talking, and then about 2 minutes into the interview, he got a phone call. And he said, excuse me. And he took the call and he spent the next 30 minutes on the phone talking to the person. And I remember all my senior managers were in the room that day, and they all turned and looked at me. I mean, it was, a clear violation of our culture and everything that we believe. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to have to go back to the CEO, because by then we'd gotten a venture nominated CEO for the business. We didn't all have enough grey hairs back then to run it ourselves, and tell this person that this incredibly expensive process that we'd been through to find this individual couldn't go forward because we'd rejected him. And as it was, we weren't in the best of personal relationships at that point. So there was me having to go back to this guy and tell him, ain't gonna fly. And I remember my whole team like looking at me like, are you going to uphold our values? Are you, even though it might cost you personally big time, are you willing to do this? And I did. And, much to his credit, our CEO understood. He was not a happy man, but he totally understood why. And we started the process again. But there are moments like this in businesses that become defining. The people want to know that you want to live those cultural values, right?
Yep. And as you were talking, I was just thinking, I remember going for a job interview a while ago. And the guy was interviewing me, his phone rang, and he got up and walked off and took this call. And he came back and he said, sorry about that. And I went, I just think that was rude. And he said, what do you mean? I said, I just think that was rude. And he started it. I said, there's no way I would work for you. Like, goodbye. And I left, because it's just like, you just know that it's not a company I'm going to enjoy working for. But I think your story, where you say you're under pressure, it's costed a lot of money, the most junior person gives a thumbs down, lots of companies would have just talked her out of it, and the values are then just a waste of time. They're all a waste of time. Not just one of them. They're all just bollocks.
And that's exactly the point. At that point, they're all a waste of time. And I think that if you ever want me pounding the table on something, one of the things that they're not teaching in business school and in, all the places that people come from, and then out of that, they decide to start business, is ethics. I think ethics should be a mandatory part of people's education. What is right and what is wrong. That desire for success pushes people to bend rules, to, do things that they should not do, that they know are the wrong thing to do, yet they'll do them because they can't succeed otherwise. And we've got to reset things, I believe. Now I'm sounding like an old guy.
Yeah. Well, I was going to
sound like my dad.
I was going to say, what is it you know now you wish you'd known earlier?
Probably the most important thing is when I started Vine at a point where I had achieved financial success and didn't really have to worry about was it going to be successful or not. And what it meant was that I could afford to do things the right way. I could afford to say, no, you know what? Even though that's the hard way to do things, that's the way we're going to do it. And because if it didn't succeed, I had other options. And what I realized a number of years after that experience was that if I had somehow managed to create that attitude in myself before the financial side of the equation was the reality, I could have started companies way earlier. I knew enough to start things. I knew where opportunities lay. I had the skills to do it. What I didn't have is my conviction to be able to go do it. And there are mind games one can play with oneself now, where you say, how would I behave if I was in a position where I didn't have to worry about the financial side of the equation, and then behave in that way? So as my yoga teacher used to say, how would I behave if I was enlightened? And that's the way you should behave, right? How would I behave if I had the economic wherewithal to not have to worry about whether this thing works or not? What is the right way to do it? And that is the right way to do it. And, the ethics part of the equation, I think, is something that we all need to go back to what's right and what's wrong.
Very good. And what books have you got? What book recommendations have you got for me?
Well, I'm not reading enough technical business stuff currently. I find myself going back to my original love, and one of the things that took me into technology in the first place, which was my love of science fiction. It's a wonderful genre and has matured greatly in the last 60 plus years that I guess it's been around, plus, and I'm rereading a book that I've read when it first came out, a book called Nexus by, I'm going to say, Ram Nunez. It's a trilogy of books, and it basically talks, it's set in the relatively near future, and it's about what happens when brain implants become possible, and they create this thing called neural dust, if you will, that allows us to sync our brains. But in the course of telling that story and all the twists and turns, he basically describes a lot of technologies that we are currently wrestling with and that we are having discussions on. That, what happens when AI reaches AGI capability, when it passes the Turing test? What do we do about that? Who gets the technology? Who doesn't get the technology? What does that mean to society when this stuff starts becoming a reality? And he does an incredible job of exploring the nuances of it all. I mean, really, for a first novel, it's amazingly well done. I find it very poignant to read. I'm reading it 10 years after it first came out, and it's as relevant today. If anything, it's more relevant than when it first came out. And, the things that he highlights as the opportunities and the things that he highlights as the dangers, we're right there. These are the things that we are having conversations around, and he does a great job of framing all those things. So if you got time, give him a read.
I'll have a look at that. Thank you very much indeed.
Great chatting. Thank you.